Yes, hello. Thanks everyone for joining today. I'm Jeremy Henry. I am the head of the data practice at CoStrategix. And today we'll be talking about AI and its impacts on data and analytics. The agenda for today, talk a little bit about AI, how it fits into data and analytics, and then talk a bit about AI agents and how to get your data ready for those AI agents that are coming, including business context, which is becoming more and more important. We'll talk a bit about governance, particularly AI governance and how it fits in with data governance. And finally, some of the ways that AI can impact your organizational structure. So this first topic is just a bit about data and analytics and how AI is reshaping the landscape there. This first slide, this is a quote from the Gartner Data and Analytics Conference, which I attended back in March. This is one of the key things, one of the key trends we're seeing. He said, the future belongs to those who blend human and machine intelligence to drive meaningful impact. So this is kind of a shift away from where in the past we were just looking like, where can we splice AI into our business, and more focused on how to get people and AI to work together. And this word impact, this is also a noticeable shift from action to impact. I think a lot of the AI work in the past years resulted in things like chatbots, natural language interfaces, summarizing meeting transcripts. And those do qualify as actions using AI, but they didn't really move the needle on business value, right? So in 2026, we're seeing that shift away from some of these more novelty uses of AI, some of these smaller use cases, and towards AI that really has a real impact, which means a measurable business impact, right? And what does that look like? How do you know which AI use cases are going to have a meaningful impact? Right now, it comes down to workflows, business workflows. So these are activities that actually drive your company to deliver value to your customers. Things like planning your factory production runs for the coming month or provisioning a new customer into your product. These are the things that agents can understand and can help you with and can help you automate. Now, other use cases like, can you use AI to talk to your data? Sure. And that may be a valid use case, but the question you have to ask is to do what? What workflow are you trying to accomplish when you're talking to that data? If you can't identify the workflow, then you can't really automate it. And if you can't automate, you can't scale it. So at some point, you have to keep asking those why questions until you can drill down to some actual business workflow, real workflow. And that's how you know you're touching on real business value. Workflows is a great way to think about AI. The same as we think about data, right? In data, we don't just create a data warehouse and some dashboards and hope somebody uses them. We have to identify the particular workflows where they can be integrated, and then determine how that data and that dashboard is going to impact that workflow. And that's the same thing we're seeing with AI. How is AI going to impact that individual workflow, right? So again, these could be specific operational workflows or things like onboarding new employees, month-end closeout on your financial. All those things are the workflows that are going on every day in your business. So this is a matrix from Gartner, again, from Gartner, and this is a useful way to think about workflows, I think, and how you could start introducing AI into those workflows. I'm not going to talk through the whole slide, but you can see it's broken into these four quadrants, right? And on the left-hand side, you can see, well, was the workflow designed with humans in mind or with AI in mind, right? Was it a human first design or AI first design? And then across that top, the question is whether the work's really just going to be improved by AI or whether the workflow itself is going to be completely transformed by AI. And most workflows are going to start in this lower left, this little green one down here, where each worker is kind of independently using AI to work faster and better. And that's a lot of what we're seeing right now, people using LLMs in their own daily work. And from there, the workflow can migrate or move into one of these other quadrants as we start to introduce more powerful uses of AI. One thing to know about this quadrant, though, is you can't necessarily just choose your quadrant. You can't say, oh, we're going to go transform this workflow and we're going to put it in this upper right quadrant. There are constraints you're going to run into, things like security, data availability, risk, regulations, government regulations, things like that. So some workflows, they may end up smearing across multiple of these quadrants, or you may have to break some workflows into multiple workflows depending on, so some pieces can be done by human and an AI-driven approach, and a human-driven approach versus AI and an AI-driven approach. This is a slide from a webinar I gave a couple years ago, and I have an update on it, which I thought I'd share. So this slide talked about the radiologists who don't use ML will be replaced by radiologists who do use ML. And that's kind of an obvious, sounds like kind of an ominous prediction, and the wording kind of assumes a zero-sum game. Like there's this fixed number of radiologist positions, and if you wanted one, you'd better learn ML. And the update to that is that now, in 2026, 10 years later, after this number came out, there's actually more radiologists now than there ever were before. So AI has helped to scale the overall use of scans. It's opened up possibilities of scans in novel ways. So it turns out that the radiologists were actually the bottleneck, right? The ability to interpret them was actually the cost of doing that was the limiting factor. And now that these radiologists are able to work faster and more efficiently, the cost has come down, and they're able to process them faster. And it's opened up radiology into some new areas, like using scans during surgery or in research studies where before they may have been cost prohibitive. And this is an example of what they're calling a ripple effect, where the introduction of AI had an unintended consequence on the overall industry. Another example of this I was reading about was in a customer service space, a financial services company, and they had introduced a chatbot because they were trying to reduce the number of call center representatives that they needed in their call center. But in the end, the chatbot resulted in more questions. Customers would start chatting because they just needed to change their password or something. But in the end, they started asking about investment strategies and whether they need to change their allocations and things like that. And that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. The company ended up with more engaged customers who asked more questions, but also required more trades and more services, which increased the overall revenue. So in the end, they actually had to increase the number of call center reps, and they had to start staffing the call center with some certified financial advisors, right, who could actually answer some of these more complex questions. So that's another example of that ripple effect that was similar to the radiologist example. Now, did this original prediction come true? Like, were those radiologists replaced? Like, okay, now there's more now, but are these different radiologists than there were before? That's hard to say. But the takeaway here is that it turned out it wasn't a zero-sum game. AI didn't limit the options or limit the amount of work to do. It expanded them. It turned out to be a force multiplier, which brings us to this next concept, this idea of the scarcity mindset versus abundance mindset. And I know at least, at least in my position over the last couple of years, I've heard a lot of this defensive scarcity mindset, right? Like, what's going to be left? They're considering it a zero-sum game. There's only so much work. Which task can you do versus which task can you hand over to AI? And this terminology like, oh, if we don't, figure out how to incorporate this, we'll all lose our jobs. And that's more of that defensive mindset. But keep in mind this abundance mindset, this optimistic view of AI. This is more asking what is possible, looking at AI as a force multiplier. A rising tide raises all ships. And you hear terminology like AI is going to help us deliver on our mission, or think about how AI can help us solve this problem. And which mindset we use affects how we talk about AI, and then how we talk about AI can affect the overall mindset of our companies. So when talking about AI, try to avoid that scarcity mindset. Keep in mind that scarcity mindset, it limits people's thinking. And like we saw with the radiologist example, it may not even be true. It may not be a zero-sum game. So instead, focus on the possibilities and how AI can help. Keep that optimistic mindset. A new topic, a big topic in 2026 is agents and how agents can help us and maybe transform the way that we're working. First, I want to start by level setting on agents. Just kind of what is an agent? Agents are just LLMs, like a GPT or a Claude, but they can do stuff. So, as an example, just imagine you ask ChatGPT, like, how do I book a hotel online? And it can give you a pretty good answer, right? It can give you kind of a step-by-step instructions on how to book a hotel online. So imagine you look at it, you're like, well, that seems like a pretty good set of steps. ChatGPT just go execute those steps. And imagine it could, right? It could call the APIs, it could find the necessary information and then execute each one of those steps in turn. That's what an agent is. It's this LLM. You only provided a goal. I just want to book a hotel online. And it figured out the steps to accomplish that. And then it actually did it. It followed those steps. So that's the idea of an agent as I'm talking through these next couple of slides. Um, this is an idea of maturity, agentic AI maturity. I got this from a company called Starburst. I thought it was a pretty good list. And it starts with this maturity level number one, where you just have AI productivity, humans using models for efficiency. This is probably what you're seeing a lot right now, where people are using AI to answer questions or to help write emails, summarize meeting transcripts, things like that. They're just individual efficiency helpers. The second stage of maturity would be this agentic productivity, like the one I just talked about, where your individual task can be turned over to an agent that knows how to accomplish that task, like writing an email or booking a hotel, something that can actually impact the real world. This third level of maturity is this agentic workflow. So this is where you take the entire workflow, like onboarding an employee, and that might require tasks in a number of different departments, right? It has to be set up in security and payroll and HR, right? So if you can imagine an agent that accomplishes each of those individual tasks within an overall workflow. That's the agentic workflow idea. And then finally, you have this entire agentic workforce. This is where all of your, or many of your workflows have all been automated through agents. And now you have humans that are more supervising the execution of those workflows by the agents, as opposed to doing all the individual tasks themselves. So this is just something to think about as you start introducing agents into your workflow. You're generally going to, start at one and move up this levels of maturity as you incorporate agents into your workflows. Now, some of the audience of a certain age might recognize this picture. This is James Bond and Miss Moneypenny. And you would remember from the movies, right, that managing agents is not always easy. And especially when they become more powerful, like when you start giving them access to sensitive data, like your bank account numbers or your credit card numbers, or you're letting them like send emails on behalf of your company, they're going to need some human oversight. And that's where this idea of a guardian comes in, right? So this is a new role that we're seeing being created in order to oversee agents. So these guardians would ensure that the agents are operating within approved governance policies and they deliver the intended outcome. So are they actually accomplishing that goal like we talked about? And then are they accomplishing that goal within the guardrails, within the guidelines, within the approved methods that the company allows, right? And the guardians, they're not just going to, kind of say yes, no. They're actually going to have to be grading these agents across a number of different dimensions, right? This like reliability versus time to value, or skills versus simplicity, safety versus innovation. So that guardian role then has to assess these agents so the agents can either be swapped out or improved, whatever might be needed in order to optimize them, because there's a lot of trade-offs involved. Now, I don't think that this guardian role would be a full-time job. I feel like it's going to be a lot like a data steward, which is an existing role, which is usually just an additional responsibility for certain people who have expertise in that particular data or that particular workflow. So I can see that guardian role evolving in the same way. Just a reminder, so agents are not a solution for everything. We're still going to need some deterministic activities. This idea of deterministic versus non-deterministic. Deterministic is like if you write a C++ program or you write a Python script, it executes exactly the steps that you tell it in exactly that order every time. Whereas LLMs are more generative AI, they're non-deterministic. They can give you different answers every time you ask them, or different answers on different days. That's kind of their superpower, right? They're more creative. They can give you unexpected answers. But enterprises still need determinism in some cases, right? For accomplishing scale, where you need to be processing like millions of transactions, like payment transactions, right? You want to do that in a very deterministic manner, right? So you can scale it and you can trust that those payments were all done in the exact same way, which is the correct way, right? So what does this mean for agents and LLMs? Um, some things that are creative, sure, you work with your agent, you can work with your LLM. But things that need to be deterministic, like how to process a payment, once you've determined, okay, what's the correct process by which we want to process these payments, you want to lock in that logic as a deterministic flow or process. Now, how do you actually do that? A lot of LLMs, you can just ask them, hey, can you capture this logic as a Python script or as SQL? And it'll give that to you. For agents, they have an idea of skills where you can capture, this is a kind of a deterministic flow that I want you to follow when you get to this step in your instruction set. So there's a couple different ways, but keep that concept in mind as you're working with agents, which pieces are deterministic versus which are non-deterministic. And then agents as non-player characters. So this was an interesting insight where the gaming world has already been creating agents for years in the form of these non-player characters or NPCs. They made a whole movie about it with Ryan Reynolds called Free Guy. That's what this image is from. These characters, you'll see them in games that you're playing. They have goals. They have to interact with the world that they're in. They have to react to real players as well as to other NPCs. And the people who develop those NPCs have already identified, they've been doing this for decades, and they've already identified some standard challenges that could indicate where agent development could experience similar problems, right? So the first one here is like realism versus performance. Creating lifelike complex AIs is resource intensive. So there's always going to be that trade-off, that balance that you have to find between that realism and performance. The second one, avoiding robotic or repetitive behaviors. So you've seen like these NPCs that, constantly walking into a wall, they can't bust out of that loop. Agents can run into that same thing, right? They keep trying to accomplish a goal, but if they're not getting the result that they are expecting from the real world, they'll try it again. And you can end up with these repetitive loops that you have to teach or train your agent to bust out of. And then finally, this ensuring NPCs react correctly in chaotic or unexpected scenarios. So, and this can because of, they didn't find the API that they expected. It didn't work. They got an error. They found data that was different than what was expected. You need to make sure this is where guardrails come in, right? Being able to say, hey, when the world doesn't react the way that you expected it to, you have to still stay within these guardrails. You can't go completely off the rails. Okay, next talking about data for agents. So the introduction of agents has changed a bit how we think about data. Agents are hungry for data, and we need to think about how to get them the data that they need in a form that they can use it. So when we talk about data, most of us, especially folks in the DNA industry, right, data management, we tend to zero in on things like data warehouses, right, analytics data. But there's also these 4 separate data environments that we need to be thinking about with agents. This first one is your transaction data, right? This is where your operational database is. They're mostly transaction oriented. They're built for concurrency, sub-second SLAs, and all that. The second one is the analytical. That's the standard data warehouse, like most of us are familiar with. The third, streaming data. So this could be event logs. It could be data coming out, like sales data coming out of your POS systems, but it's like flowing in real time all the time. And then last is your unstructured data. So this is stuff you'd find in your data lake, like your emails, PDFs, meeting transcripts, things like that. Now, your agents may need to access data across all 4 of these environments. So you need to figure out the security, the governance, and how the agents are going to actually access the data in each of these 4 environments. And one important thing to consider is cost, right? There's costs associated with having to deal with these 4 separate environments. One of the big ones that you would see is pre-processing. So imagine if you had a bunch of data scientists, they're writing agents, they want to start processing this data. Most of them are going to start with some pre-processing of this data. In the transactional data environment, they're going to want to do some joins. They like one big table, right? Getting it into that single data frame that they can pass into Python. So they're going to do that pre-processing by doing all those joins of the third normal form database and getting into that one big table. analytics, there's not a lot of pre-processing on an analytical database. The data warehouse, that's the whole point of it, right? You already did the pre-processing. On the streaming side, most data scientists are going to want to batch it up. They're going to want to put it into like a daily file or an hourly file as it's coming over the stream so that they can easily query it, they can easily filter it, things like that. And then on the unstructured, this gets a little bit tricky, but a lot of the pre-processing there would be like passing that data in through like an LLM, pulling out key tags or loading it into a vector database. A lot of that may be specific to a particular use case. So I'm not, the ability to do pre-processing on unstructured, a little bit more fraught. But keep in mind, if you just, loose all your data scientists on these data environments, they're all going to be doing a lot of the same pre-processing. That could be done more efficiently. It could save you some costs if you do that in a more centralized manner, right? So imagine doing some of the pre-processing and then making that pre-processed data available or the pre-processed metadata available to your agents and making sure you're communicating that out to your data scientists, to your agent developers so they know where to find it, where it's accessible. So again, they're not duplicating that effort. So look for opportunities like that. That's just one example, but there's a lot of things that the data scientists or the agent developers that they think are really easy. So they're just going to go ahead and do them. But both in terms of developer time and tokens, it could be more efficient to do it in a centralized manner at an enterprise level as opposed to that distributed level. The data lifecycle. So if you work in data and analytics, you've probably seen some version of this data lifecycle. This is where, you start with data by adding context, you get, information, which is, data with meaning. You can add judgment to get insight. An example here would be like if you have a credit score, right? And then, knowing the context, okay, this number is a credit score. And then judgment, is it a good credit score? Is this a bad credit score? Is this person good or bad? And then the decision, right? Do we want to offer this guy a loan? And then the action, do you approve the loan, right? So this is where you're trying to take some initial raw data and take it all the way through that data lifecycle. Now, usually when we build out these data lifecycles, we only take them so far, right? We're usually stopping at some point and say, okay, now we're going to present this information to the human, to the loan officer, whoever it is, so they can use that information to make whatever decision, whatever judgment call they need to make. So there's some kind of built-in stopping points when we usually build out a data lifecycle. Or there's a human in the loop, right? Who can, stop the presses, who can halt the lifecycle at some point before a bad decision is made, before a bad action is taken. And the thing we need to remember with agents is they can automate that entire life cycle, right? They can take it all the way from data through insights, decisions, through actions, and they can do that autonomously. They can do it in an automated fashion. So that means it's happening much faster and there's less opportunity for humans to be involved to stop bad decisions being made, to stop important decisions from bad decisions being made. So from a data management perspective, we need to ensure we're supplying our agents with the best possible data. And what does that look like? Well, the key reason we need to do that is because your agents are lazy, right? Right now, agents are based on LLMs. LLMs are lazy, and therefore your agents are basically lazy. They're not going to do like a deep search to try to find better data, right? They're usually going to find the data that they've been instructed to look for, and they're going to stop with whatever they got, whether it's good or bad, which means you really only have two options. One, option A, you can give them easy access to good data to start with and try to tell them, like, start with the data in the data warehouse or start with data that has a good layer of metadata built on top of it, right? So pointing them towards the best data as a starting point. Your option B, you can teach them to critically evaluate the data that they find. So imagine you're not pointing them towards the data, you're telling them to go find the data. There you might have to teach them to critically evaluate that data that they found before they actually use it. You can give them the dimensions upon which, like a rubric upon which they can evaluate that data, or you could also ask them to do it themselves, right? Ask them, how would you determine whether this data is fit to purpose? And they may be able to identify what are the characteristics of good data. And then you instruct them, okay, I want you to evaluate the data along those dimensions before actually using it. So putting some of those checks into the agent itself. So agent ready data. We've had this concept of AI-ready data, and this is the idea of agent-ready data. And there are some things, a lot of times when we just think about data, we just think of accuracy, right? Does the data reflect what's actually happening in the real world? But in addition to that, in addition to just straight up data quality and accuracy, you can also do some things to make your data more valuable to your agents. So like this first one, right? Sensitivity classification. So this is, imagine if you're classifying your data, which you should be, as like public or private, proprietary, identifying, what groups can see it. This is executive only data, or this is available to the entire, anybody in the world. And you put that sensitivity classification, if you put it right on the data, on the row of data, or in the data set itself, and it travels with the data, then when the agent uses that data, they'll have access to that sensitivity classification. And that can be important for things like if they're trying to like write an email that's going to go out to all employees, right? Knowing that it can only include information in that email that's visible to the employees, right? Or if it's in a customer newsletter, if you're using an agent to write a customer newsletter, making sure you're using data that's visible to the overall public. So keep an eye on this number 5, business context. I have a whole section on that. These other, I'm not going to go through all these, but what does it actually look like if you actually prepared like all these? A lot of this looks like metadata. So a lot of it would be in like a structured database that would be in the same scheme, in the same database, maybe an additional set of tables that can be joined easily against your data. It could be stored in, like if it's metadata, it can be stored in a catalog tool like a Calibra. Keep in mind that to your agent, data in your catalog tool may look like another data silo, right? Like they would then have to be given access to that and understand how to interface with it, how to access that data, and then how to join it against your regular data, right? So just making sure that you've built all those capabilities into the agent, you have that access layer and all that. And you don't have to store your metadata in a catalog tool, right? You could just store it in a parallel database as long as you explain to the agent how to access that metadata along with your data. And when you start to consider your raw data together with the metadata, then it starts to look like a traditional data product, which is, an older concept, this idea of data contracts, data products. And when I say older, I'm really just meaning like it predates like ChatGPT, right? So it's been around a while, and it's a collection of data and metadata that conforms to a data contract. And this allows you to provide the data to your consumers, but also give them the information that they need to process it. It gives them some measure of reliability, some assurance of quality, and that makes the data more usable and more trusted by your data consumers. So these things like the contract would include like the format description. So what does each table represent? What does each field represent? The usage and access policies, that gets into like the sensitivity field we were talking about before. Update and refresh frequency, how often it's updated, the freshness they can expect, service level agreements, performance, and outages, things like that, uptime, quality thresholds. So again, these are like your quality metrics that should be available with the data, and then versioning restatement when it has to be reformatted with new fields or fields that are removed. We have CoStrategix has a client here in Cincinnati. We're helping them to build a data product for their sales data. And that's the data product, right? They've gathered all their sales data into a database that can be consumed by their internal teams, right? And there's other data products for things like, customers and products and things like that. But the one we're helping them with is specific to the sales data. And this data product that contains the sales data, it has millions of transactions, but they're all formatted, they've been vetted, they're available in a relational database, they're queryable in an easily understood data model. And this company has internal clients who use the data for things like identifying high selling products, identifying per store sales volume, things like that. But they also have external customers that they can send this data to, who can do things like analyzing customer trends or product correlations, right? Which products are typically bought together. The data product has SLAs, it has quality checks, and it does have that versioning and restatement. So all the things you would expect if you were to be buying this data from like a third-party broker, like a Nielsen, right? But this is just their internal data that they're packaging up in a similar way so that it's easily consumable by their internal teams and stakeholders. And in the future, that could be by agents as well. So these same types of things that make your data reliable for your data consumers and understandable by your data consumers can also help with your agentic projects. And some of the things that would cause those agentic projects to fail over there on the right-hand side can be addressed through the introduction of data products. Context. So the last section we talked about metadata, and I mentioned that one aspect of metadata was context, and that's the business context. And this is becoming a big topic in AI right now because we're finding that agents really need that business context in order to be useful. So this is just one note that in the past, so data management professionals, people who work on data pipelines, who work on data warehouses, in the past, our main focus has been on building pipelines to prepare data for dashboards, right? Presenting it to people so they can consume it. In the future, that may shift, that role may evolve to building data context to prepare the data to be used by agents. So that role may change. That's one you probably want to get out in front of. The people who are building your agents, who are introducing agents into your workflows, they're not going to wait for the data to be data ready, to be agent ready. They're just going to start using whatever data they can find. So getting out in front and starting to build that context into your data so it's already available to your agents, that's again going to help those agentic efforts be successful. So the idea of business context, what is it? So imagine you want to build an agent or have an agent evaluate an individual sales transaction to say, is that fraudulent? Does that represent fraud? It's going to need more than just the data that it can find on the sales transaction itself. You'll get things like a store number, an amount, maybe a product code, maybe a tax or tendered amount, things like that. But that's not much to go on. An agent's going to need more than that to determine if that transaction was fraudulent. For starters, it's the type of information you're going to see over here on the left, like what does each of these fields mean? What's their definition? Who created this data? Where did it come from? Where does it go? That's the history, the lineage. How old is this data? This last one is really important, right? Is this normal? Can I compare this against trends for this customer or for this store, right? To determine, is this an outlier or is this normal? And that's the type of information, the context that you would be providing. What are those patterns that the agent can then use to determine whether or not it's an outlier or whether it's normal? So think about how you can supplement your operational data with this type of contextual metadata. So given that ask, then it's, okay, can I use AI to help build that data context, right? And the answer is, in some ways, yes, which is great. So especially these first two, like building an ERD from a schema, that's relatively straightforward. You could just ask an LLM to do that for you. Your technical metadata, so this is just things like timestamps and location. That's easily accessible for an agent or an LLM. These next two, like your graph database and then your knowledge graphs, your ontologies, these are going to require a bit more human involvement. You're going to have to be involved in the creation of some of these types of context. But especially at scale, the LLMs or the AIs, the agents can still help do a lot of the heavy lifting. The last one is the one you really have to pay attention to, this data dictionary business glossary. This contains all those subtle nuances that occur in every company. Things like how do you measure revenue or how do you measure profit? Now, for many companies, especially private companies, these subtle differences have evolved over the life of the companies and they've built up, they've compounded, and there's a lot of them. AI can't figure that out for you. You really have to tell the agent all those little nuances, all those little details. Now, where do you get that? A lot of companies will already have it. It's just not all in one place. Some of them do have a data dictionary or a business glossary, which is great. That's a great start. Some of it might be like in the fine print of your quarterly reports. Another good place to look is like onboarding materials for new employees. Like this is how we do, payroll here at our company, right? So some of those written explanations you can find in these different sources. It's nice that you can just take those same written explanations so it can handle that language-based information. So you'd still have to gather it all up, But if you can, or you can point your agent to it, it is going to be important to track down all these kind of data dictionary, business glossary nuances to help your agents and build up that context. If you remember the data lifecycle, you remember where context fit into there. So it's becoming part of the data lifecycle. What does it actually look like? So CoStrategix, like the work I do here, we help a lot of companies organize their data, get that data ready for consumption. A lot of it is kind of based on, you can see this medallion architecture right in the middle, building that three-stage architecture through bronze, silver, gold, getting the data ready for consumption. And you can see there's kind of an additional layer being built on here where you're adding in the semantics, the entity resolution, the knowledge graphs. And these are the types of things, that metadata that we're adding on top of that gold data in order to make that data ready for agents. So that's that context intelligent framework that we here at CoStrategix are working to build out. Governance. So governance is really becoming a key part of the AI conversation. Was in terms of data, now it's also in terms of AI. So AI governance, what is it? A lot of governance is aimed at answering these two questions, right? Should we use AI for this, and within what constraints? This first question has come up a lot in the news recently with regard to like the US military, the Pentagon wanting to use Claude from Anthropic. What constraints Anthropic can place on the Pentagon's use of the models? The two big questions that keep coming up are, can this model be used for widespread surveillance? Like, what are people doing? Where are they at all times? And then secondly, can AI be used for autonomous weapons? And these are big questions, right? These are like Terminator, Skynet type questions. Your company may not have that big of questions, but even smaller questions should give you some pause, right? So questions like, should we let AI determine our billing rates? Or should we let AI determine who might be impacted by a layoff, right? Which employees? Should we let AI determine how our clients are prioritized in our service queue? So these are all questions that could impact your company's bottom line. They could impact the well-being of your employees or your customers. So they're still important questions. And the second question, within what constraints, that's doing a lot of heavy lifting, because all the concerns you've heard about bias, guardrails, privacy, regulatory concerns when it comes to LLMs, all the rest of that all falls under this second question, right? What are the guardrails that we need to place on when we use AI to solve these problems? AI governance, why now? So you maybe have seen this quote. It may be apocryphal, but this is from Thomas Watson at IBM back in the 40s. I think there could be a world market for maybe 5 computers. And it turned out that was a big underestimation of what it turned out actually to be. What we've heard this year was from Gartner. The forecast was assume 1,000 to 10,000 agents per enterprise. If Gartner turns out to be as underestimated as Tom Watson, then there could be just an absolutely huge number of agents in your enterprise. So now may be your last best chance to get some governance in place for those agents before they become ubiquitous, right? Before they become so integral to so many workflows that you can no longer remove them or start limiting them. So that's why jumping in on governance now is important. AI governance versus data governance. Current recommendation is to combine your AI governance with your data governance. It's closely related already, and you don't want to necessarily duplicate all the infrastructure, the roles, the communication that you've already built out for your data governance. And also, you can consider folding in things like your cloud governance, your environmental science, social and government governance into there as well. So again, you don't have kind of this expansion of a bunch of, like, you don't want to have multiple repositories for your SOPs, right? Or your policies or your standards, right? You want a single place, a single repository where they can all be found across all the different governance disciplines. I did want to touch on one aspect where data governance and AI governance intersect, this idea of governance as code. So at the heart of your governance is your policies, your standards, and your SOPs. If you think about all those policies and SOPs and standards, you can think about, they're basically just sets of instructions or rules. Could I automate those using an agent or an LLM? And the answer is yes, right? written instructions. Agents love that, right? That's exactly the type of stuff they need to do their work to accomplish a goal. So this idea of your governance policies and standards that are accomplishing like different agents for access security, data quality, building that metadata, building the context and metrics governance. You can imagine that if you automated all those through agents and then had those agents working together to accomplish your governance, that now becomes the machine by which your raw data is turned into your data products, right? Available for your data consumers. So we usually think about this machine as like a bunch of pipelines and transformation code. And then we think of governance as like this separate thing over here that's watching and auditing that machine. But with governance as code, when you start automating those policy standards and SOPs, then the governance itself, those agents that are enforcing the governance or implementing the governance, become the machine. So in the end, you may just have those agents that are producing the data products, as opposed to having it all going through all your pipelines and et cetera. So it's a different way to think about data management, about governance. So that's something to think about as we move into incorporating those agents into our data management. Organizational impact. So some of the way that AI is being used could affect some of the roles, some of the structures within your department or within your company. So this is a quote from Michael Gabbard from Gartner. He says, the majority of DNA leaders were hired to drive change in their organization. Continuing to play it safe is risky. I think his main message here is to do something, try something, move forward. Don't wait for AI to settle down because maybe it never will. So Peter Henson is an author. He talks about this concept in his book called The Uncertainty Principle. He calls it the never normal. So my interpretation of that is, this idea of, we're waiting, oh, what's the new normal? Well, what if there is no new normal? What if there's a never normal? And if you think about it, like the data space, and that encompasses AI, agents, the types of things we're talking about today, it's incredibly easy to pivot, to change direction in the data space. Other industries, like the medical industries, you're limited, like the speed with which you can do things is limited by things like clinical trials, just the slow pace of human metabolism, how long it takes to see whether a drug works or not. In manufacturing and construction, you're kind of limited by the laws of physics. It just takes time to manipulate matter. If you needed to build a building, build a factory, if you needed to, we want to change this product. Well, to produce 1 million of that new product is going to take time, right? It can't be done instantaneously. But in the data space, you can tear down your entire data environment and rebuild it in the same day. And in that speed, that flexible environment, the idea of creative destruction becomes the driving factor. So as you'll hear, like Mark Zuckerberg, he's famous for saying, speed is the strategy. So if you ever think you've got hold of a new normal, that you understand this current environment, just keep in mind you could be wrong, right? Maybe the world has already changed. You just don't realize it yet. It's like in those commercials, right? The cartoons when Wile E. Coyote walks off the edge of the cliff, and the only reason he hasn't fallen is because he doesn't yet realize that the foundation he was walking on has disappeared. So what's the antidote to like a constantly changing environment where there may not be a new normal? Keep in mind things like anticipate that change is going to occur, and then adapt as that change does occur, as you see it occurring. And then be resilient. Bring as much energy to the new work as you did to the old work. To leverage AI, 3 things needed: mindset, skill set, and tool set. Mindset, we need to have people that are mentally ready and willing to work with AI, data and governance. Skill set, they need to have the knowledge of how to use AI. And then tool set, having the AI technology available at their fingertips. So these things all fall under that idea of change management. And remember that change management is really just preparing the soil, right? You've heard that saying about, when you're growing a garden, right? The gardener doesn't grow the plants, only God grows the plants. The gardener just prepares the soil. So in your organization, be thinking about that need for a gardener, right? Making sure you've gotten all the conditions set up right for a new technology like AI or agents to flourish. What does that look like? You need to make sure you have a budget and a plan. to explicitly address the change management across all three of these dimensions. Human in the loop versus human on the loop. We've talked a bit about human in the loop. So this is where there's a human checking every step that's performed by that AI or agent. That itself may be evolving a bit to this idea of human on the loop. So this is where we have like an AI or an agent that's accomplishing all those steps more autonomously, and the human is just monitoring it for the final output. And that idea of that guardian role, like we talked about before, where the human becomes the guardian, he's checking to make sure that the goal was accomplished and that it was done within the guardrails and the guidelines that was set up. So keep in mind, when you automate a workflow, you'll likely first have humans in the loop. But as you gain more trust in the agent that's performing that workflow, or as your agent becomes smarter or better, then you may want to move more to that human on the loop, just in a monitoring role. New roles. So we're seeing the emergence of some specialized roles to help manage and govern AI. Some of these are just kind of to fill gaps, like this idea of this guardian. Who, like we talked about, manages or oversees agents. The agent development, obviously, that's a new technology, so we'll need people to develop that. Some of these are kind of to fill gaps where the agents may be a little bit, have a gap right now, especially things like ethical judgment. And, what does that look like? We don't necessarily have a good answer to how to answer questions about ethical judgment. You can think about like a jury in a courtroom, but their job is really more to decide truth as opposed to whether it was right or wrong, right? They're just deciding whether or not the law was broken, not whether the law represents, right or wrong. We are reading now in the news about some of these larger model companies trying to go to like religion in order to teach their models ethics. So this idea, maybe the including something like a priest or a rabbi in your governance committee, that may be something that we want to look into in the future to help answer those questions, like should we even be using AI to solve this particular problem, right? So maybe having that role, that person, specifically for ethical judgment on like a governance committee, or to address individual questions that may come up by the agents themselves, that may become that new role to help put those guardrails on your AI. And this decision engineering, decision governance, decision engineering. So however those decisions are made, tracking what evidence was used, how it was weighed, how it was prioritized, what was the eventual decision, that's becoming more important. So you could go back and understand, well, how was this decision made, or how did the agent make this decision? And while a lot of these roles that I mentioned here in these bullets help the agents, like these are helping the agents be, fill their gaps or to become more efficient. This last one is just for humans, right? AI and data literacy. So this is important to make sure that we're bringing along all the people on this AI journey. Some new organizational structures. So this idea of a lab group, so bringing some business people together with tech people. This is often just to get things started, get people comfortable with tools, security, guardrails that go along with LLMs and agents. This next one, an AI Center of Excellence. So this would be like a small group that's just providing the expertise, answering questions, enforcing the guardrails for various people who are using AI out in the organization. And then this last one, tiny teams. So these would be small, flexible, task-based teams that can blend humans and AI agents. So again, it looks a little bit different than your current teams because, again, they're passing some of the work off. They're going back and forth with agents. Some of the tasks are being done by one or the other, and the tiny teams are helping just to coordinate it. The blue note down here at the bottom is important. Start with centralized and evolve to federated. So that idea of a lab group and AI Center of Excellence, those are often centralized, but then you're going to evolve to this federated idea where you might have tiny teams in each department and each BU, and they all may just refer back to that AI Center of Excellence to get the standards, the policies, answer those questions. So that idea of centralized versus federated would occur in your evolution as well. And don't forget the potential of AI. This is kind of my final thought here. We've seen a lot of these kind of revolutions that have come along, and like the internet, mobile phones, email, we've seen all those in our lifetime. The And there's often some good, but it also comes with some bad. With the internet, we had this potential for universal knowledge. A lot of the internet right now is cat videos, mobile phones. The idea here was we were going to ubiquitous connectivity. All people could be connected to each other. Phones are mostly used right now for things like Candy Crush and cameras. So there's that upside and downside. And right now we're seeing AI used a lot for where can we get efficiencies, where can we save money, and those are good things. I'm not downplaying that, but I also want folks to remember that AI is creative and it can generate creative output, and you can use that creative power to solve big problems. My analogy here is this: imagine if your company hired Albert Einstein, right? So you got Albert Einstein in, it's his first day, he's a new employee in your company. What would you ask him to do? Would you ask him to, like, let's see if we can make our developers work faster? Can you find some anomalies in the data? Can you act as a chat bot, right, to help answer customer questions? And he could do all those things, and he could probably do them really well. But you could also ask him to help solve some of the big problems in your company or maybe in your entire industry. So every now and then, I would just ask you to remember to step back a little bit from those kind of day-to-day problems, the everyday efficiencies that tie us down, and think about what are the big questions, what are the big problems that we could bring AI to the solution. So thanks everyone for attending today, for your attendance. I appreciate it. And I wanted to see if we had any time for questions. Audrey?
So thanks, Jeremy. That was really great. We have just a couple of minutes here for questions, and I do see one. If you have any questions, please feel free to add them into the Q&A, and we'll get to those. Let me look here. The question is, um, actually, this one is, if agents are just going to access the data directly in those four environments, then do we still need to create data warehouses?
My answer there would be yes. Um, the the idea of data warehouses, they're great for agents, but they're also for humans. So the idea that humans are still going to need to have access to data and good data in order to make business decisions is still going to be around. Even with agents that are automating your workflows, or that agents are helping make people make better decisions or automating workflows, you're still going to have that need for humans to understand, put their finger on the pulse of the company. And that's where data warehouses really help out. So I don't think it's an either or. I think both are needed. And the fact that your agents can access the data out of your data warehouse is just a bonus, because that's really good curated data. And the more that your agents access the data out of your data warehouse, the more their decisions are going to align with the decisions of the humans who are using that same data.
Great. There's one other question here that we'll get to. And again, if there's any other questions, feel free to add them into the Q&A right now. But this one, you mentioned the ripple effect that often leads to hiring more staff to handle increased engagement. How do we sell this abundant mindset to a board of directors that is explicitly looking for AI to provide a reduction in headcount?
Okay, good question. I don't know that you're necessarily selling the abundance mindset. Um, I don't know that this is more of a recommendation for the folks that are attending this webinar, as well as maybe for the people that you're working with who are doing the work with agents and with data in your organization. And again, that gets back to that last question, right? Like, what should we be using AI for? Yes, we can use it for efficiencies, but we can also use it to solve big problems. So as far as selling it, like up the chain or up to leadership, I don't know that that's one of the pieces that you would take to them. I think you would still want to take to them individual workflows, and how those workflows can be improved, transformed, or made more efficient through the use of agents, not necessarily just the idea of abundance. So not sure if that completely answered the question, but that's the general idea.